Okay, good evening everyone. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and tonight we're going to take a look at a couple of endgames, and this is going to build off of a show we did a couple of weeks ago, maybe in a reverse direction actually. So a couple of weeks ago we looked at the Vancouver position, which is a fairly sophisticated drawing maneuver in rook and pawn endings that can allow the weaker side to draw, even sometimes down 2 pawns. Well, today we're going to take a look at an even simpler ending, in fact perhaps the most simple of all drawing maneuvers, at least against pawns that aren't rook pawns or knight pawns, and that's the Philidor position. And the reason why I'm going to take a look at this tonight is because a few days ago there was an odd series of coincidences. And the first was that I was just watching some blitz games on ICC, and in 2 consecutive games, or not consecutive, but there were 2 games within about a 10-15 minute period where very strong players both lost when they could have had a pretty easy Philidor position draw. One of them was even a grandmaster. Now, the only thing that can really be said on their behalf is that I think, at least in one of the cases, maybe both, the defending player had a pawn of his own and was more interested in defending it. While if that pawn hadn't have existed, I'm sure certainly the grandmaster and probably the other player too, who was quite highly rated, would have just found the proper drawing method without any difficulty. And then the next thing that happened was a day later, I had a rook and pawn ending in a blitz game against another FIDE master, and well, we'll see the adventures in that game. But there too, I won, in part because my opponent failed to draw using the Philidor method. So let's briefly review what that method is, and then we'll turn to my game. Okay, so here's our position. It's black to move. White is coming down the board, like so. Oops, like that. And so black needs to figure out what the best drawing mechanism is. And if you don't know what it is, I would say, by all means, stop the recording at this point and try to figure out what black to move ought to do. So there are 3 moves that are at least worthy of consideration here. One is very, very simple and achieves the draw without any sweat at all. The second move is less simple but also holds the draw, while the third move probably loses, though actually maybe a sophisticated draw still, but that'll go beyond the scope of anything that we need to cover here. Okay, the worst move here I would say is rook to e1 check, because then white plays king to d6, and black is going to have to go through all kinds of difficulties to save this, if he even can. If he can, it's going to start with king to c8 and going from there, but it's going to be a difficult chore in any case. All right. A second way to draw, though it requires a bit more sophistication, is with rook to d1. And then after king d6, king c8, rook h8, rook to d8 with the idea of king e7, and then pushing the pawn. And the best way to meet this is with rook h1. And what's key here is that black has sufficient room on this side of the pawn to give checks without white's king being able to come over and bother it, without allowing black's king in front of the d pawn. So for example, let's say white plays something like king to e7, hoping to get in d6. Alright, now black is going to start checking, and once the white king starts coming over towards the rook, that gives black time for king c7, after which it's a very, very simple draw. So white needs to play something like rook to e8 to stop the side checks, but then the rook goes back to d1, king goes to e6 again, hoping to push the pawn, so once again we stop it, rook e7, king d8, and now if d6, then rook e1 check with an easy draw. So king f7, just go back to d1. And white's making no progress. So despite all of this, though, this is not the easiest way to draw. The easiest, and it's very easy way to draw, is with rook to a6. And this is the so-called Philidor position. What black's strategy here is to keep white's king from getting to the 6th rank. White can't win unless his king gets to the 6th rank, and the only way he can do that is by playing d6. But once he does this, rook to a1. And once again, white's king is going to have no safe place to hide from checks. So this is just like the side check example, but here it's from behind. See, that's the whole point behind rook to a6. If we wait, if it were white's move here, white would play this kind of clever in-between move, king to e6, threatening rook to h8 check, and then d6 check, and winning. And if black plays rook to e1, then king to d6, and we already mentioned this position earlier, very difficult position for black to hold. And if after king to e6, rook to a6, now it's just a straightforward loss. d6, threatening rook to h8 mate, and black has to bring his king all the way out, after which it's very simple. So king e7, d7 wins. Alright, so by playing rook to a6 though, and waiting for d6, and only then playing rook to a1, we take advantage of the fact that white's king no longer has any safe place to defend himself. Now, what if white doesn't play d6? Well, in that case what we do, we just wait. So rook to g7, rook b6, rook f7, rook a6. By the way, if white brings the rook kind of within sniffing distance of the black king, ignore it. All right, you can do it, you can attack it, it won't cost the game, but sometimes that can get you in trouble if you don't bring the king back to the queening square. So the simplest thing to do, by far, is leave your king on the queening file, keep your rook on the third rank, ignore all the little cheap bids for attention, and only when white plays d6, play rook to a1, or rook to whatever file 1 is relevant at the time. So rook to a6, check, stay on the queening file, rook f7, ignore the rook, stay on the queening file. Okay, if he goes back, you go up. No reason not to take as much space as you can in the position defensively. Okay, he comes over towards the rook. Just for safety's sake, go to the other side of the pawn. No reason not to. Rook a7. Rule of thumb would be to keep your rook as far over as possible for the usual reasons, to have as much distance between yourself and the king for checking distance. Even if it doesn't really apply here, it's just a good rule of thumb. d6, and now to the back we go. And just check him to death, and if he leaves the pawn, then hey, we'll win it. Also, let's go back to here. If white plays something like rook to a5, or no, okay, let's say rook to a4, maybe better. If white plays rook to a4, check, he blocks. Well, now of course we can take, because this is an elementary draw. You just have to know that the king goes straight back in these positions, so that way whichever way the white king goes, the black king goes the same way, and white can only give a stalemate, nothing more. So that's the Philidor position draw. Rook goes on the 6th rank and sits, and wait until d6 happens, and once it does, the rook goes flying up to the back of the board, and you check away, and it's a draw. Alright, so now let's take a look at a game that I played. Again, just the day after I saw those 2 failures from the Philidor position. Alright, so I have black here. I didn't play the first part of the game like a complete genius. I dropped a pawn, and okay, I'm not 100% sure that I'm lost here, but it's I have excellent losing chances. They're outstanding, really. And you know, I'm just hoping that I can swap off to something that's tenable. That's all. All right. So he plays king f3, defending his pawn. I play rook to a8. He plays rook c6, rook a5, rook c7. Okay, now I make a good move, I think. I play g5. All right. He plays rook to b7, and I have to watch out for this threat of rook to b5. So now I have to leave my pawn alone, and whichever way his rook goes, I defend my pawn the opposite way, of course. So rook c7, rook a5, rook b7, rook a8, and he does something different. So e3, I played king to g7, d4. Okay, now here I played something kind of interesting. I played rook to a4. May not be the best move, but it's a playable move. And I mean, ideally, I want my rook behind the pawn, so that's generally speaking a good thing. So he plays d takes c5, rook c4, and that's a little bit of mission accomplished for me there. d5 would be maybe more testing, with the point that if rook takes c4, he has d takes e6, and he's winning still another pawn after which I'm clearly lost. So e takes d5, c takes d5, king f6, and maybe I'm holding on here. A couple of options here. So if he plays d6 and then d7, I think after rook to a8, maybe I'm holding. For example, rook b6, and now after rook h6, I have rook c8. And all of a sudden, I've got some counterplay here. It's not that I'm going to win or anything, but if I can tie down one of his pieces, either the king or the rook, it at least improves my drawing chances considerably. So, again, it's definitely premature to call this a draw. I certainly wouldn't do that. But it's just that I have better chances with one of his pieces tied down, that's all. Okay. Another possibility instead of d6 is for him to play rook to b6 check, trying to bring my king into passivity first before playing a move like d6. But here again, I should go active. So king e5. This is it's a basic rook ending principle, but it's one that's very easy to ignore because we're afraid of giving up pawns. I mean, I'm down a pawn already, and I've got weak pawns to boot, and so it's very natural to want to defend them. But without counterplay, without activity in rook endings, whether you're on the upside or the downside, it's very difficult to get the result that you want. So king e5 is the principled move here. Rook takes h6. And now a couple of things to consider. Maybe king takes d5, the obvious move. Rook h5, f6, h4. This looks like trouble. So, okay, I've got my c-pawn, but I'm probably going to be down too much. Another possibility is maybe g4 check, trying to mess up his structure. So hg, king d5. Now rook f6, c4, rook f7, c3. And see here, maybe I'm getting some play. A little tough to believe. I mean, I'm would be very, very surprised if I'm not simply losing here too. But at least there's a little glimmer of counterplay. But I'm in trouble. So I think d5 may be a promising approach. Okay, but he played d takes c5. I played rook takes c4, rook c7, king f6. Okay, the point of the little arrows there is that if my pawns were on the squares that the arrows point to, then I think my drawing chances would be even better. Whereas here on h6 and g5, they're a little bit looser. The h6 pawn in particular could become weak. Generally speaking, defensively, it's a great thing if you can have all of your pawns protecting each other. Well, all but the base. So the f7 pawn, of course, is never going to have another pawn protecting it, unless it moves up, and then the e6 pawn will be unprotected. But in a structure with h5, g6, f7, and e6 pawns, then all but one pawn is taking care of itself, and that helps the drawing chances considerably. So he plays g4, which fixes my pawn on h6 as a potential weakness. Though I need to say, I hasten to say, that I would be more than delighted to swap off this pawn on h6 for the pawn on c5. If that were to happen, it would be a very simple draw. So it's not that white wants to just allow that exchange, but the fact that the pawn on h6 is perennially weak is a small factor in his favor. Okay, so I played rook to c2, hoping to tie his king down to the pawn on f2. He played c6, king g6, rook c8, king f6, c7, and now an interesting moment. I played king to e7. I certainly... Okay, well, so remember we talked about this when we were discussing the Vancouver position, these various ideas where the rook that's in front of the pawn, the passed pawn, moves over somewhere and there's a skewer, right? So I was aware of these kinds of ideas and, of course, thought, well, okay, if I play king to g7, then I'm safe from that. But what I was scared of was his king's getting active. But it looks like after king e4, okay, now not rook takes f2, of course, because he just plays rook to g8 check, or rook to d8, and he just wins immediately. And not rook to c6, I think, because after king to e5, then once again I'm in Zugzwang. If I move my rook this way, then he just plays rook to d8 or rook to g8 check. If I move my rook vertically, he plays king to d6. Again, I'm in trouble. Even if I check him and he goes to e7, that's not a very good position for me either, probably. His king is definitely too friendly in that position. if my king moves, then he plays king f6, and that just wins right away. So this is a tough position. But if I simply play f6, and then on, well, let's say if he moves the king, I just wait, or I just wait in the position. Then I think I'm okay. I mean, the problem is that there's this barrier. I mean, his king can't get across any further than d4. It goes to d4, but that's it. It can't get to d5. It can't get to c5 because of my rook. And his rook is stuck on c8. So he really doesn't have anything better than just rook to e8, going for the swap. And, all right. I think that this position should be a draw. Of course, I still have to be a little bit worried here, no question, but the fact that his king can't stay safely on f5 probably lets me survive this. And now if f4, I have rook to a4 check, and I win my pawn back. And if he plays just f3, then this. And this should be a draw as well. So it looks like I could have held with this passive approach. But again, it's very dangerous to play passively. You really reduce your margin for error. And, okay, more often than not, it's a bad thing. But sometimes it can succeed. And I was certainly aware of this possibility. Just I didn't have time to really consider it. And I felt that if I did that, I was burning my bridges, that I would just I would have no chance to recover from that approach if it was mistaken. Whereas with this active approach, even if it ends up not being best, I'll still have enough activity that I can keep fighting and fighting. So I tried this. But objectively speaking, the passive approach was better. So king e4, king d7, rook f8, king c7, rook f7 check, king d6. And now I'm in trouble. If his rook and my king castled, then I would be great. So if my king were over on f6, his rook was on d7, this would be a draw, no problem. My king would be able to defend all of the pawns, and I should hold. But the way it is here, with my h-pawn cut off, I'm probably losing with best play. So I think he should have played rook to f6, and then after king e7, here, not king e5, which is just atrocious, and I win, but rook takes h6, the obvious move, rook f2, and now king e5, and I'm just dead. This would be the end. You know, aside from whatever issues on the clock, you know, that might give me some saving chances. But as far as the objective merits of the position, there are none for black. So I was fortunate. He played rook to h7. I played rook takes f2. He played rook takes h6. And okay, here I would like to play king e7 and king f7. Again, if my king can fend off his rook, so if my king and his rook are mutually neutralizing with respect to my pawns, then I should draw. But for now, my king is cut off, and that gives me problems. Again, I can't play king to e7, trying to rush over there, on account of king to e5. So I played rook to h2. Maybe rook to a2 can be considered, but yeah, actually rook to a2 is perhaps worth considering. But I think after rook to h5, well, no, okay, now maybe I can play rook to h2 again. Because if I defend this way, then I think h4, well, no, even this is all right. Rook a4 check, king f3, g takes h4 with a draw. So rook to a2 is also a good move. So I chose rook to h2, and I think this is probably still okay. But my rook isn't active, so it's better to have the rook on a2, almost surely. So he played rook to h5. I played king to e7. And here he had his last chance, I think, to gain an advantage. So king e5 would have been the right move. King f7, rook h7 check, king g6, rook e7, rook h3, rook e6, king f7. Okay, again, not king f5 because of rook f3 check, but e4 first. But still, rook to f3, and I think I'm holding on here as well, especially with the threat of rook to f4. So really it looks like his last chance was when he should have played rook to f6 back here. So if he plays rook f6 here, I should be losing. But having missed that opportunity, I believe the position's a draw, and I don't think I gave him any more chances the rest of the way. So instead of king to e5 here, which we just looked at, he played king to f3. I played king to f6. and I achieved the drawing structure that I mentioned before. So my king can handle any threats that his rook makes to either the g pawn or the e pawn. And given the fact that his own pawns are quite loose, the h3 pawn and the e3 pawn both, it's very hard for his king to go on any little adventures trying to cause me pressure. So at this point, really, I assumed it was just a matter of how long before he got bored of trying to beat a dead horse and offer me a draw. So here we go. Rook h6, x6 check, king f7, king e4. Okay, now we saw king to e5 can be big trouble for me, so I played rook to e2, which is an accurate move. Rook h5, no problem. King f6, check, king f7, king f3. I go back to this pawn. e4. Okay, so this I don't mind seeing because now his king no longer has any route into my position. For his king to penetrate, now he's going to have to go all the way around to the c file, well, to the d file. But and once he does that, then I'm going to play rook to a2 or a3 or wherever my rook is at that point and have side checks, so he still won't be able to get in. So at this point, it's even more drawn. So I play rook to h1, and now he plays e5, and all of a sudden it's happy days here. I played rook to e1. Of course, the position is still very much a dead draw, but at least now it's a dead draw with equal material, so I don't mind. Time was okay. I mean, we both still probably had around a minute left. The game goes for another 35 moves, so and there was no increment, so we both had plenty of time here. I probably would have accepted a draw at this point had he offered one. Though, you know, the thing is, when your opponent is beating the dead horse for a while, when you finally get the chance to have a little fun, just to be on equal terms, even if the position is a draw, it becomes a little less attractive to accept it at that point. So I might have made him suffer had he offered a draw, but he never did. So rook f6, king e7, rook h6, rook e5, h4, takes, and again, you know, at this point, I'm just enjoying having material equality, but there's nothing to hope for. I mean, this is ridiculously drawn. So king f6, rook h6 check. Of course, I don't want to play king to g5 because then he trades rooks, and then I have no winning chances. Again, this is just ridiculous. Objectively speaking, I have no winning chances here, but hope springs eternal. So king f7, king f4, rook a5, check here. Yeah, at least I pushed him back a rank. Okay, I don't let him penetrate here. Nothing to do. Alright, so I make a little cheapo if he plays king h5, rook h2 mate. And here he starts to lose his marbles a bit, or a little bit more maybe. So g5 check, and I play king to g6. And now with this threat of rook to e4 check, he's at least in danger of losing the pawn. Again, this is all silliness. It's all hopeless. I mean, he could play rook to a4, but I still probably win the pawn with rook to h2 check and rook to h5 if necessary. But, all right, this is all quite silly. So rook to b6, rook e4, king g3, king g5, king f3. So he rushes right over with his king to the e-file as quickly as possible. Absolutely right thing to do. I play king f5, rook b7, rook a4, check, here. Okay, now, in this position, white to move, what should you do? What's the best move here? Now, to be honest, there's practically no move that doesn't hang the rook that doesn't also maintain a draw. So as long as you don't play rook to b4, or rook takes e5 check, or rook to a5, I don't think there's a losing move here. But there's clearly a best move in this position, and that move is rook to b3, so basic Philidor. The king is going to go to the e-file then, and you just sit, and you wait. And eventually we're going to get to a position like the one we already saw. So let's say I play rook to f4, plays king to e3, I play rook to h4, threatening skewer. So king to e2. Let's say I play king to, no, not rook, king to f4. Okay, he can play rook to b4 check. There's no point, but he can do it. Rook to b3, rook h2, king e1. And here we are. Basic, vanilla Philidor position once again. And I can do whatever I want to, but as long as he just leaves his rook on the third rank, keeps his king on the e-file, and ignores everything I do until I play e3, well, not letter of the law. I mean, if I play rook to b2, he should take the rook. But any normal move that's not e3, he just basically ignores it. And when I finally play e3, rook to b8, and then he just starts checking away with an easy draw. So that's what should have happened, and it would have been a draw. But my opponent played rook to b7. Again, this doesn't lose yet, but it's just a bad move. It doesn't make any sense. It gives me opportunities that I just simply don't deserve, that the position doesn't merit. So I play rook to a3 check, king e2, and now once again, I don't want to play e4 because then he's going to get the Philidor kind of style draw with just check, 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 check. And likewise, I don't want to play king to e4 because then he can play rook to b4 check. So I play the in-between move, king to f4. In-between move, not like a Zwischenzug, but in-between in that it gives me half of what king to e4 gives and half of what e4 gives me. So now if he plays rook to b4 check, again I get e4 in, so that's a success. Note, by the way, there's no such thing as a second-rank Philidor with rook to b2. I play rook to h3, and I'm making a little bit of progress. So king e1, king f3, and already it's becoming quite dangerous. I'm not sure if it's a loss yet, because maybe I think he can still draw with rook to f3 check and just keep checking me. So I think he's still drawing with that, but again, his margin of error is really going down rapidly. Okay, so rook to b4 check is not brilliant, but maybe survivable. But what he can do to draw is play rook to e7, and this we discussed already, or something very much like this, where you stick the rook behind the e-pawn, and ultimately you're going to try to prevent it from going to e3. And this is called the Karstedt maneuver, by the way. So here, rook to a2 check, king e1, e4, say rook to e8, and now if king to e3, king f1, check, here rook e1 with the idea of playing king to d2. See, without that, I can't advance this pawn, because if I play king to d2, I'm just losing the pawn. If I play king to d3, he just plays king to f2, and I still can't push the pawn. I can play rook to a2 check, but after king to e1, all we've done is played ring around the rosies. So rook to e1, now threatening king to d2, but then rook to a8, and he's going to just give all the checks in the world on these two files until my king goes too far away, and then he plays king to f2 with a draw. So we already saw this in the previous game file. So that would have been a good drawing maneuver. By the way, I definitely want to point out here that in these situations, the king should always go to what's called the short side of the board. And it's called the short side because we take the pawn and we imagine that the board is cut on that file. So this side only has 3 files, this side has 4, and so the side with the 3 is the short side of the board. The reason for that is because we want, it doesn't really matter with respect to the king. What does matter is how much room the rook has. And you always want to have, if possible, 3 ranks or 3 files in between the rook and where the king is starting out from. So let's suppose white played king to d1. We'll see the difference. Rook to a1, king c2, rook to e1, and now rook to h8 just doesn't work the same way. Black plays king to f2. Here king to d2 is no good because of simply e3 check. And if rook to h2 check, well, no problem at all. King to g3. Now, actually, this doesn't quite work out because white has king to d2. So this actually allows him to save the position, I believe. Don't think white has any tricks to worry about here after rook to a1, rook to h8. Yeah, so it's closer, but so white still has this nice little tactical trick here. But without that, it would be a loss. And you can see the point is the rook has no place left to go, and then white will have to see black play e3, bring the king back in, and then rook f1, king e1, e2, and so on. So always best to go to the the short side with the king, so that way the rook is going to have plenty of room to check from the side. Okay, so there are ways for white to draw, but as we see, they become increasingly sophisticated with each inaccuracy that my opponent makes. So he plays rook to f7 check. I play king to e4. And see, now that his rook is committed, my king is perfectly safe on e4. I'm going to get rook to a2 check in and gain another rank. So rook f8, rook a2, king e1, king e3. And after king to f1, e4. Okay, here he plays the right move. So he plays rook to e8. So I thought, shucks. After all these mistakes he made, he may still save the game by the Karstad maneuver. We'll see if he knows it. So rook to a1 check, king g2. And of course, again, if I play king d3, king f2, we saw this already, rook a2, king e1. And now, okay, e3 is just terrible because, again, it's like the Philidor position. He just checks me to death. And after king to e3, king f1, again, go to the short side. So we have the same deal. Cut the board on the e-file. The short side is the place to go. And rook to a8, etc. with a draw. So instead of king to d3, I decided, well, let's try rook to e1 first and see if he knows what to do. Notice that this just transposes, though. So that would just be a long way of getting to the same position. So rook to e1. And here, we already know the right move is rook to a8. And again, the threat... Oh, I'm sorry. The threat here is for me to play king to d2. And then play e3 and king e2 with a win. Rook to a8 draws. Instead, he plays rook to e7. And now I make lethal progress. King to d2. Played rook to d7. Again, the better move would have been moving the rook to the a-file. Now it's easy. And he still hasn't gotten the idea. Only now does he finally play the rook to the a-file, but it's too late. King e2, e2, king d2, rook d8, king c3. And here, and not a moment too soon, his flag fell. But of course the game is lost, because whenever he plays rook to e8, I simply promote. And if he checks me, no problem. I just wiggle my king on down the board towards his rook until he finally has to stop checking me and either give up the rook for the queen or allow me to queen. So that was the game. And again, for my opponent, who's a FIDE master, to allow this is not good. But, it shows, it's kind of sad. I mean, chess is just such a tough game. And I think the moral is, because it's such a tough game, we at least have to have a really good grasp on the basics. And Philidor's position is just fundamental. I mean, if you don't have that, then it's very, very difficult to save any rook ending at all where you're worse. I mean, that's just, that's bedrock. So know your basics, know the fundamental endings. There's more than enough in chess to stymie all of us. I've blown drawn endings and failed to win won endings before as well. I'm sure I've played endings as badly as this one, but we at least have to do what we can to save ourselves the worst case scenarios like this one. So know your basics. Make sure you know the Philidor position, the Lucena position, the Karstad maneuver, and even Vancouver probably ought to be known as well. So I think if you know those 4 fundamental rook endings, that'll help you tremendously. Even in blitz, but certainly and most importantly in your slow games. So you don't have to know a huge amount, but if you know some fundamental rook endings, then you can use those as a guide when the position is more complicated to know what you should and should not steer for. So I hope this helps. If some of you enjoyed this for the Schadenfreude, that's okay by me too. But mainly I hope that this is instructive for you and will perhaps allow you to learn from my opponent's error rather than from your own. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.